Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Learn how to hunt for threats using Cloud Native SIEM, sponsored by Sumo Logic. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams, SANS Senior Instructor, James Pleger, Manager, Sumo Logic SpecOps Team, and Brian Gardner, Senior Threat Analyst, Sumo Logic SecOps Team. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Hey, thanks so much, Carol. Really appreciate it. This is Jake Williams from SANS. Really appreciate the introduction, and I am thrilled to be joined by James and Brian today from Sumo Logic to talk more about Cloud Native SIEM and how we ultimately hunt for threats using it. Why is it different? How does the paradigm shift a little bit? And let's get into the content, right? So first off, I want to talk quickly about the new normal. Talk about some Cloud Native SIEM advantages, integrating threat intelligence. Talk about supply chain security. I'm going to tell you the majority of consulting calls that I have been on in the last, month and change have involved something about supply chain security. Even when it's not about that, people are asking me about it. And what do you know? We're like, hey, well, let's chat about this, because we may not be able to prevent it, but we sure can detect it with the right tools. I will talk a little about the threat landscape, and then we're going to see a threat hunting demo actually using the tool. And this is pretty fantastic here. So let's get in and chat. All right. So first off, what is the new normal? Well, let's be straight, right? We, at the beginning of 2020, went home from work and moved into this work from home paradigm and said, okay, cool. And we made a lot of decisions that may or may not stand the test of time, right? The reality is that a lot of the decisions that we made involved, from a security standpoint, involved really a temporary disruption to our normal workflow. That's not really where we're at now, right? Because the reality is that most of our monitoring programs are looking at logs from servers, not necessarily workstations and laptops, because they were inside the perimeter, and now they're not. They're outside the perimeter, and so monitoring these assets is becoming increasingly critical. Also, software as a service, right? We know that a lot of employees can effectively work using SaaS platforms without even being connected to the corporate VPN. What does this mean for you if you have, if you are monitoring your employees with an on-premises SIEM platform? How are those logs getting back, right? Again, if the assumption was previously, oh, don't worry, they'll be connected to the VPN, great, but not, right? And again, previously it was a small percentage of the workforce. Now I'd argue it's the majority of the workforce, at least for the majority of my clients. So this is something that we're having to deal with a bit and really think about how the paradigm has shifted. I want to talk quickly about some Cloud Native SIEM advantages. Now, listen, if you're like me, Cloud Native is one of those things that you probably throw up in your mouth a little bit when you're like, Cloud Native, oh, okay, got it. Oh, you were serious. Okay, good to go, right? Like and when I say Cloud Native, I want to be clear here, there's the air quotes of Cloud Native, and then there's like built truly in the cloud. A lot of the air quote Cloud Native stuff, right, is stuff where folks are like, cool, we're transitioning to the cloud, and that's our new strategy. I'm not going to call any vendors out here. Then there's the born in the cloud, right? And there is a clear difference here. But cloud in general, right? Why do Cloud Native SIEM deployments have advantages over on-premises deployments, and what are they? Well, first off, ability to scale immediately. And I want to talk about why this is an issue later. We'll get into more of that later. Another big one is OpEx versus CapEx. And if you are more in the analyst space, you may not be familiar with these terms. Operational expenditure, basically your month-to-month, day-to-day kind of spends, versus capital expenditure, which is like going and buying a new data center or buying brand new servers and storage and you name it. Versus, there's another piece here looking at the ease of ingesting logs from remote workers. Look, if my platform is already in the cloud, then it's not on-prem, and it doesn't really matter where the logs are coming from, whether the user sits on-prem, off-prem, doesn't really matter to me. They're still shipping logs to this remote source. And so basically there's no paradigm shift with the whole work from home or remote work. Whether you're in the office on Monday and at home on Tuesday, doesn't matter. Then there's remote analysts. Obviously, it's easier for them to access investigative data. They don't need a VPN. And it's really easier to integrate with outside security personnel. I run an incident response firm. I can tell you this is a big, big deal because I don't have to go through the complete onboarding process, right? Oftentimes, as we're being brought in to do surge support, it's like, okay, cool, the security department can create me an account in the SIEM, but if I need to get on the VPN to get to that control panel, there's this onboarding process. They're treating me like I'm a permanent employee. Like in one case, I'm in the middle of an incident response, having to go through like onboarding training, like for factory safety. And I'm like, this cannot be relevant. You can't want to pay me for this. And yet they're like, this is the policy. We got to do it. Cloud native, I don't deal with any of this. And I want to bring James in here to chat a little bit. He's on the sharp end of the spear, working with customers every day with cloud native SIEM deployments. James, is this in line with what you're seeing from your customer base?
Yeah, most of our customers have a couple concerns, and it's resources to manage something. So you talk about scaling. One of the big things that we see customers ask us a lot is, hey, we need to onboard these new data sources, or we just stood up a new cloud provider like a AWS or an Azure or something like that, and we don't have anything that can ingest. The nice thing about cloud native SIEMs is you can basically turn those on, on a heartbeat, and it's ready to ingest this stuff. So that's definitely something we get a lot of from our customers. And the other big thing that we see a lot of interest in is around just managing. Their analysts are spending less time managing and keeping the SIEM up, things like that. So that tends to be what we see from a lot of our customers.
Yeah, that management part is hugely critical, right? One of the things that I hear occasionally from customers that they'll say, well, we priced the on-prem versus the cloud native side, and it was more expensive on the cloud native than it was. And I always bring them back and say, well, now hold on a second, right? Licensing maybe, but you're not looking at total cost of ownership, right? That support is such a big deal. And just having that not be a thing you even have to think about for me is, I want to do security. I don't want to do systems administration. And so, yeah, for me, that's a big, big deal. Any other thoughts around that, James?
No, it really, I mean, honestly, being able to stand it up really quickly and then be really nimble is really important for us. So
yeah, no, definitely. And you never want to be in that spot. I speak from experience here. You never want to be in that spot where you're told you have to onboard this new log source right now, and you're like, I don't have the capacity to do it. What are we offboarding? Right? That's not a place that I want to be in. That's the nightmare. That's nightmare fuel for most CISOs. Right? So anyway, moving forward here, want to talk quickly about integrating threat intelligence, right? So threat intelligence is something that I always hear a lot about. I answer a lot of questions around this as well. Folks probably know I used to teach the CTI course at SANS. Look, the reality here is that logging and retaining data, it's great. Let's do that, right? This is the data underpins my ability to hunt. But the reality is that a huge number of benefits come from integrating the threat intelligence on top of the data, right? Again, logs are great from an investigative standpoint. Something has to trigger the investigation. And I want to throw out here that organizations with a bigger field of view can most effectively develop and apply that threat intelligence, right? And so I'll let obviously Brian speak to this a little bit more as we get into the demo side. I believe we'll speak a little bit more to this on the demo side. But also, again, as we look at this, there is an issue here with the cloud, or an advantage having that cloud native SIEM where they can test and look around multiple customer environments very easily and very trivially. And I say not poking around data necessarily, but understanding the implication of what alerts are firing, where are we seeing value with particular CTI. And so there's a lot of value here for large, basically for those with large fields of view. So I'd be remiss in 2021, early 2021 no less, not to talk about supply chain threats, because if you're in security today and you have a pulse and you're being, I mean, goodness, you're coming to work, like there's no question that you've been asked about this, right? How do we stop this? And the answer is you don't. How do we prevent it? You don't, right? You're just not going to. Orion wasn't the first. It's not going to be the last, right? I'm not here to kick SolarWinds while they're down. That's not my gig, right? Again, it's just a reality. We're going to see it. Again, it's a proven technique. There are other software supply chain attacks. The biggest thing that's bothered me on Orion is people are like, oh, brand new thing. And it's like, nope, it's not. NotPetya, Xcode Ghost, Shadowhammer, Shadowpad, CCleaner. The list goes on as we move down kind of the prolific or less prolific supply chain attacks. But they've existed. They'll continue to exist. And this is something that, as more attackers see this as a very viable strategy, I expect we're going to see a lot more of this that we're going to have to defend against, right? So again, prevention, let's talk about prevention, right? How do we truly prevent the supply chain threat? And it doesn't look like my slide's advancing. Can you next slide me here, please? Perfect. So here's my strategy for blocking the supply chain threats. And the answer, yeah, I don't have a strategy. Next slide, please. But detecting supply chain threats, this is something I can do, right? Blocking's out, but detection's possible with the right logging and the right retention posture, right? So I'll tell you that, you know, as news of the Orion breach was announced, a lot of organizations found, at least in my customer base, found they didn't have the correct types of logs, and if they did, they weren't from the relevant devices. And I'll say here, even some of my customers that had the right logs that they need, stuff like, well, we'll get into that, right? But stuff like, you know, changing their default audit policy on Windows, oh my gosh, right? Even when they had that, they didn't have 9+ months of retention. Oftentimes, this is because as they've scaled up their logging posture and saying, we need to detect more, if they're with an on-prem SIEM where they have a fixed amount of storage, if you're logging more per day, that means you're logging it, retaining it for less time. And so they lack that 9+ months of retention. And even those who then said, in 9+ months, because we discovered Orion, or Orion was discovered in December, and we know that, again, the compromise of SolarWinds was in that March timeframe where the first, basically the first, at least as far as we know today, you know, first compromised build of the Orion software went out. And so, you know, I saw from clients, you know, heard from clients where they said, okay, we now need to shift to 9 months of retention. And I'm like, well, for this one, sure, right? But that's kind of like closing the barn door after the horse has already left. But okay, let's do that. Oh, we don't have storage for that. And so again, as we talk about cloud native, I want to throw out here that, you know, as long as you have operational expenditure to hold on and retain data, you can do that. You don't have to worry about trying to pre-plan and trying to forecast what logging posture am I going to need from which devices and how long will I need it for, and making those uncomfortable, you know, uncomfortable decisions where very often as I'm adding logs, I'm having to decrease retention because I just have a fixed volume to deal with. I have a fixed size, right, of storage space that I can use for the data as well as indexing. And you know, I've been talking about my experience here, but I'd like to kick it over to Brian, who has a lot of customer-facing experience here. Brian, you want to chat a little bit about this, like correct types of logs, relevant devices, retention, that stuff? Brian? Alrighty. Well, I will. Looks like a minor technical difficulty, but I'll quickly chat here until Brian comes off mute. And I'll say that one of the things that we saw that's been a big deal for us, right, has been here that we need process creation logs. Process creation logs with command line arguments, right? This is a huge enabler for us to quickly determine, if we have those on the right servers, to quickly determine, did the attacker take follow-on actions, right? There's a lot of other stuff we can use, but I'm going to tell you that one right there is a huge enabler for us. Unfortunately, it's not a default log. Another big one that I see used a lot is share access auditing. I love share access auditing, right? I don't like the advanced. I actually prefer the basic. It's one of the few times you'll hear me say I prefer the basic mode, but I really like the share access auditing. And that can help me detect lateral movement. Now, of course, I need to know about this ahead of time. I have to turn these on ahead of time and be ready. And then, of course, as again, I'm sure you know, Brian would agree here once he gets off mute. You know, when you turn on the process auditing with command line arguments, oh my gosh, does that take up a lot of logging space, right? And so again, you know, as I look at that, I'm like, okay, cool, turn it on, I got it. And then it's like, but I'm being flooded with it, right? So anyway, next slide, please. And 2 more up, there we go, right? So the best approach for detecting software supply chain attacks, for me at least, is to have enough visibility into my network to know normal so that abnormal immediately sticks out. This is like the zero trust networking approach. Now, when I say network here, I want to be abundantly clear. I'm not only talking about networking. I'm not only saying like, go look at NetFlow. That's important. Don't get me wrong. Look, the endpoint logs are hugely beneficial as well, but I also have to know what ordinary looks like in my network, on my system, so that I can start to see the abnormal. That's what you're going to see. That's how you're going to detect these supply chain threats, right? Teams with on-premise SIEMs often lack the flexibility to dramatically increase logging posture, especially if the retention increases simultaneously. Every incident I work where there's a SIEM in place, the logging posture changes at least during the incident. And it is a horrible thing where somebody's like, we got to crank up the logging posture. I'm like, yep, because we need to know what's going on now. And then you find out that before we had 90 days of retention on what was being logged. As we cranked the logging posture, went to 30. We've got old stuff rolling off, but we need that stuff that roll. It's a horrible place to be. You don't want to be there, right? The flexibility, right, to be able to dynamically dynamically increase retention and dynamically increase log requirements is such a game changer. Again, I speak here from the incident response perspective. It is such a game changer. Next slide, please. And so I want to close up here, at least on my section, and I'm going to kick it over to Brian and James. Look, Cloud Native SIEM deployments, again, huge benefits over their on-premise deployments. Now, if you came to me 10 years ago and said, Jake, do you want to take all your security data and ship it to the cloud? I'd have been like, not no, but you know, heck no, don't let the door hit you on the way out, right? I had a lot of security concerns. I had some, you know, and also it was a little bit unfamiliar, whatever. Look, that is legitimately almost 1990s thinking, right? I said 10 years ago, so it'd be like 2010 thinking, but I've been a lot more worried about it. Today, I'm not worried about it at all. I see the tremendous advantages, and I've done a complete 180. I prefer, for a lot of reasons that we covered, manageability, ability to scale, flexibility. I prefer a cloud-based SIEM today over an on-prem SIEM. Again, if for nothing else than being able to dynamically adjust my logging requirements to my needs. I'll mention here that the recently disclosed software supply chain attacks, these underscore the need for more logging and retention than most organizations have today. And I want to tell you here that the folks that came out smelling like roses in the in this Orion attack are the folks that knew what they had, right? They had the good logging, they had well thought out logging programs around this. They weren't restricted by volume, right? They thought about this. Again, they weren't restricted arbitrarily by, hey, this is the maximum that we can put on the storage that we purchase, and we'll readdress this in 3 years or whatever when that hardware refresh cycle comes up. So with all that, I'm going to go ahead and hand off to James and Brian. James, Brian, take it away, my friends.
Awesome. So just wanted to give some background just generally on Sumo Logic and kind of why we're talking here. One of the big things that we talked about, especially with the Cloud Native SIEM side of things, and one slide forward, is the fact that scalability is one of the biggest things that you can look for as far as partnering with a Cloud Native SIEM. Our background, Sumo, we do a lot of data. So we do over 100 petabytes a day of data, of raw logs and things like that. And we've got a lot of customers. So we have a pretty deep background as far as making things scale. We are, first and foremost, we've been born in the cloud. Sumo Logic's been, in the cloud since its inception. And we work with a lot of different technologies. The big thing that I will say, and one of the things that's really interesting is we've had a lot of focus recently on the security space, since a lot of the problems that you run into from an operations and observability side of things also apply directly to security. The big thing that'll kind of point to is we're really good at finding needles in haystacks of data. And if you want to go on to the next slide, the big thing for us is just being able to fit into a bunch of different use cases. So we've got audit and compliance areas where if you're just wanting to keep things for a long period of time, you can do that. And really, at the end of the day, I think a lot of people will understand that not all data is created equally. And so if you're paying the same price to store something that is not very useful data, but only used for audit and compliance reasons, it's not a good fit. So we actually have different ways of pricing data. So it's kind of nice, just like Amazon has with their storage costs. You have different tiers. We do too, so you don't have to pay the same amount for each log, and that's one of the really cool things that I like seeing. The way a lot of the cloud technologies are moving forward. The other thing for us, so on the Sumo Logic SpecOps team, we actually do threat hunting with our customers. So we spend a ton of time, going through and helping them understand, what threats that are in their environment that might not have, vendor detection or things like that, things that look suspicious. So we'll go through and analyze that, work with our customers, and that's where we get a lot of, our background on the security standpoint. So next slide, we'll go over kind of the threat landscape. I just figured it would be a good recap for things, and it's funny because and next slide, in 2011, this is kind of the joke I say, like, everything was burning, and things are pretty much the same thing today, except we've lived with it and we're accepting it of that fact, and we've come to grips with that. So next slide. Like, one of the big evolutions that we've seen over the last 10 years is, if you look at things 10 years ago, there was just a huge amount of activity that was focused more on targeting, devices and systems. So they were targeting, the things people used. Whereas today, it seems like a lot of the attacks and a lot of the things that we're seeing is more targeting the user itself. So they're not necessarily going after their computer. They're going after, their cloud services that they're using. They're going after, databases that are interesting and things like that. There's still a ton of activity that does, affect the system, but it's really interesting to see a lot of the mainstream attacks have really moved towards that. We've also seen, ransomware and commodities, different ways of extracting data have gotten really popular. And a lot of the tools that we would use on the red team are now being used, by attackers, and the techniques and things like that, are really, really prevalent. And it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between a red team and an actual attacker, until you start getting, ransomware deployments or things like that. So that's kind of how we see, things. If you want to go to the next slide. The one takeaway that I would have for most people when they're thinking about, both Cloud SIEM and other environments is, understand that some of the out-of-the-box detection, it's very useful. It covers many bases, but you need to understand that you need to customize things based on, what your business is. And at this point in time in 2021, it's almost table stakes, that you have some sort of customized detection and things like that are focused on your business, because we see it across our customers, but the types of risks that they have, the risk to their business is significantly different. And really, at the end of the day, like, most security vendors are focused on trying to cover as much as possible, not specific campaigns that are targeting people's companies. So, along those lines, one of the other things that we've talked about is, advantages of cloud SIEMs. Like, we see a lot of folks where instead of managing a SIEM, they divert those resources and actually use that to help bolster their detection programs. And it's really good because, you can kind of shift those resources into something that's more useful and directly applicable towards folks' companies. And I think that's it from my standpoint. If you want to go to the next slide. And apologies on the technical difficulties. The GoToWebinar froze. So let me, Brian, do you want to try to open up that demo? All right, maybe you can throw over presenter to me and I'll post it. And apologies again on the technical difficulties.
Hey, while we're getting this going, I just wanted to chat about a couple of other event logs that that we place a very high premium on. You know, James brought up a really good point, right? As we were, you know, as he was discussing there, that not all logs are created equally, right? There's a lot of stuff that's useful in an auditing standpoint, but not necessarily useful in a or less useful, let's say, in a detection standpoint. You know, I always I'm a big Survivor fan. I didn't used to be, but somebody finally turned me on to it, and then I realized now I have like 25 seasons to go back and watch. But I'm always thinking about, you know, when I think about what logs am I putting on my SIEM traditionally, you know, I always feel like it's Survivor, right? Like which logs am I voting off the island because they can't all fit, right? And so I'm trying to determine where am I going to get the most value, and then, you know, even along those lines, right? You know, particularly if I have a, you know, lesser experienced team behind me at a particular client site, I know I can go and configure stuff. But basically, I know that I can go back and configure, you know, configure basic, you know, logging, et cetera, and get them set up for their environment. But I can't always, you know, rely on them to you know, basically handle that once I'm gone, right? And so one of the things I'm always thinking about is, you know, hey, go through and work through your use cases, right? And how are you going to get best value out of, you know, out of logging? I also mentioned here that as we come in and do threat hunting in a lot of environments, and we rely on log data for that, there's often log data that's just not there, right? So this is another spot where, you know, as they were talking about, the Sumo team here was talking about the basically the ability to get threat hunting done, or help, basically helping with threat hunting through that, through their cloud native platform. That you know, that basically you've got kind of that resource right there. I don't want to say necessarily built into the product, right? It's clearly a people asset, right, versus the product, but they immediately have basically immediately have the you know, that access, right? So you know, your Sumo team, if you're working with them, has access to your back end there, right? So let's see, Brian just popped back in. Let's see if I can go find Brian and get him re-added to, let's see, Brian, I see you popping back in here.
He's back. Yep.
Oh, you're back. Perfect. You got him. Excellent. There we go. Winning. Okay.
All right. Sorry about that, guys. I'm really, really sorry. So let me get into the actual demo here. So we pre-recorded this, and I'll kick this off. All right. First, I just want to thank Sans and Malware Jake for allowing us to do this webinar today. Thank you all for joining the call as well. Today for the demo, we will begin with a brief overview of Cloud Security Enterprise, the CSE product, and then we'll go over a few common scenarios we utilize for threat hunting while showcasing CSE's functionality. And we'll also demo just a little bit of the continuous intelligence platform, which we call SIP. So right here, we are within the CSE platform, and this is the main screen that you'll see once you log in. There's a lot going on here, so I wanted to take a few moments just to kind of go over everything so that everyone has an understanding as to what they're seeing. So this is CSE's HUD. It's pretty much a landing page built to give a high-level overview of what's happening under the hood. With that being said, there's plenty of actionable information given as well that will help guide your workflows. And we can kind of quickly discuss each section here and sort of show you how we utilize it. So the Insight Radar, this giant round mass here, is kind of the main attraction. So it gives a graph view of records, signals, and insights over the time frame you specify. And you can specify the time frame right here. So we've got anywhere from 4 hours to 7 days. So you can hover outside the blue line graph to get record counts. So we can see records here for that time frame. You can go over the blue bars in the middle portion to see sort of like the signal count that we see. And you can go over the red triangles to see insights that have been generated within there. So this view allows you to see the general flows of data and gives a visual interpretation of what CSE does with your data. So it starts with millions of records, works those into thousands of security relevant signals, and then triggers insights when an entity reaches the risk score deemed appropriate for an analyst to investigate. So the next piece to this is search. So that's up here at the top. So if we click this, this is pretty much front and center. So it helps the analyst to dive in immediately, looking into insight signals and entities that they're interested in. It also allows you to specify which data points you are interested in and create filters for future use. So you can see sort of some of the searches I've utilized recently, they'll all be saved within here. So if we go back to the HUD, so the insight activity feed, that's this part over here on the right. This is pretty interesting. So it's a really quick way for, like, if you were a manager or a team lead, or even just an analyst, and you want to see sort of what's going on within the environment or what your peers are working on or your reports, you can just look immediately and kind of see, like, okay, this one Brian's working on, some of these just haven't been addressed in any time. So you can kind of get a quick understanding as to sort of what's occurring with your staff or with your peer analysts in here. So at the top, it'll show you sort of the top insight that's still open based on the risk score of the entity that it's associated with. So that's this one up here. So you get like the baseball card view, and you can click into this and go into the full insight view and begin an investigation if you would like. In addition to this, you'll see an activity feed that gives you like a little bit more information regarding this insight. So if we look over here to the left, this is our sensor status. So it gives you kind of a bird's eye view of all of your sensors. So this could be like your network sensor, your Windows sensor, etc. Anything in red that you see is considered offline, or it might be in need of an upgrade. It just depends. The light blue dots that you'll see are running at full steam, so they're good to go. So we can see we've got one highlighted here, Semele, and then this is the information for that sensor. If we clicked on one of the bad ones, we can kind of see like this is a Windows sensor. There's definitely some sort of issue occurring with this. And then we've got a couple of orange ones. So there's definitely an update available for this that we would like to push out. All right, so the Insight tab is the next part that we're going to go into. So we kind of went over this briefly. And then we'll look at this Insight tab. Okay, so insights are where the analyst should spend the majority of their time in CSE. They're a grouping of related signals, all associated with the same entity. They display the series of events that happened in an easy to analyze way while providing all of the information available within CSE in one place. So it's also important to note here that insight generation can be adjusted numerically to a threshold of your choosing. Currently, the default threshold when we ship the products, and I believe here in our test environment as well, is 13. So that's the score that an entity needs to reach prior to an insight being generated. And this can definitely be adjusted. We've done it with customers in the past. Some are a bit more mature, and they want, you know, an insight to be generated at like a score of 9, etc. So if we click in one, we can actually view a bunch of the signals that made up this insight. And you can sort of see over here on the right, there's a severity. So that numerical value is how this insight is derived. So if we say that the insight creation is 13, obviously we're going to need multiple signals on this entity to add up to 13 or above before this insight would be generated. Okay, moving on to the signals tab. So signals are sort of how CSE splits security relevant records from the rest. So we analyze every record that comes in on hundreds of rules and anomaly type detections along with threat intel to create signals. So they are associated with an entity and then correlated together to create insights, which we just showed. So this will kind of cover the majority of what you would look for as you're working through an insight. You're going to break out into probably a bunch of these different signals and see like the relevance to them, if they are good or if they're a false positive or if they need tuned, etc. So moving on to the entities tab. So entities page is where you can see all of the IPs, host names, and usernames in your environment. So this is the view of all of the entities. You can filter through them. You can view specifics for each one. The key here is obviously you can see the activity score. The higher the activity score, obviously you're going to want to dig into that entity. It's only a matter of time before an insight's generated. So the score is at 11. So if we wanted to see what was occurring with this one, we can click on it. And you can see here at the top, we've got signals associated with it. There's insights, there's other related entities, and then there's history for this one as well. So if we move on to the records tab. So the records, this is essentially where your events are ingested from SIP, and then you're able to search across these. So if we just took object type, and let's just say we want to look at like endpoint process. This is just looking at the last 15 minutes. Obviously, if we click here, we can change to whatever we want and custom time frame as well. So we can see we've got a bunch of endpoint process events that are within here. If we open one of these up, you can kind of get a view. So the initial view here, you'll see a couple of fields within this. These are able to be changed. If you were interested in, say, like, I want to know what the description is, I don't care about the parent base image, you can hover over it and there's this little star. And this is what we call favorite fields. And this will change the quick view that you'll see. It's somewhat useful, especially like if you want a quick glance and say, like, I'm only interested in looking at the command line for these. That's all I really want to know. You can just highlight that, remove the rest, and then you'll have a quick view of those. This is the view that we provide. So the extracted fields, everything's like this. If you wanted the more traditional log view, you just click on full details here. And that's pretty much what I believe most people are familiar with seeing. This just looks a little bit better. So if we move on, we're going to skip the investigations tab for now. We'll come back to that later. We're going to look at the content tab now. So this is huge. This is probably where, when I get engaged with a customer, I spend the vast majority of my time for the first week or two with them. And the reasoning for that is you can see that we've got a lot of stuff here. So we've got rules, threat intelligence, match list, file analysis, custom insights, network blocks, entities, and suppress lists as well. So if we look at network blocks, this is one of the sticking points that we have with a lot of customers, and it's stuff that we hear from a lot of customers as well, is that when we're trying to baseline an environment and understand what is occurring in that environment, a lot of times the customer doesn't even have this information. So what we're talking about here with these network blocks is this is the ability for the customer to give us everything on their network and break it down. So you could have like a servers block, you could have your DHCP, your DNS, your auth servers. There's a ton of stuff you can put within here, your guest network blocks, all of that. If the customer isn't able to provide us this information, a lot of the hunting that we do is kind of futile. We keep running across false positives and we keep wondering what this system is or what, you know, the function of this network segment is. And the key with this is that we want these to be configured and set up because we have these labels. And these labels actually give us the ability to match, you know, as records come in, and we can immediately see like, oh, okay, that's, you know, a network packet from the server LAN, like that shouldn't be going to the guest network, something like that. It's really important that we do that. It's one of the things that it kind of drives us nuts, because a lot of the times what happens is we understand that, you know, the customers don't have this information and it's something that's critical. And a lot of that comes down to just disjointed communication between like either the network team or the security team, or just people don't keep track of this stuff. So the ability to add all of these network blocks in is huge. It really does help. It provides a ton of value for us. The next one within here too is the match list functionality. So match lists are a way for us to whitelist. And this is extremely important when we come up with new content, or if we're doing a threat hunt and we don't want to include like, you know, vuln servers or things that are going to flag that we're not looking for. This is another one where we spend a lot of time because we want to understand all of the auth servers, the business domains that they use, the default accounts, their DNS servers. There's tons of stuff that we put within these. We've got watch lists, VPN servers, verified IPs, verified domains. All of this makes our hunting far more efficient, and it also gives us really higher fidelity results. Granted, this stuff does take time to set up, but when you set it up, you're getting value almost immediately. And this will also be value that's driven into the signals and insights that are created, and it'll cut down a lot of that noise. Okay, so now that we kind of went over that, let's actually start looking at some stuff here. So we're gonna look at threat intelligence first. And we've got a couple of feeds here. What we'll do is we'll pull this up. So there's definitely 4 ways that we can ingest threat intelligence. By far, the one that I use the most is CSV. I love this. And this is the one that we'll test out today. So to me, when I think about this, it's kind of like threat hunting is, to me, a means like by which analysts deliberately seek to identify malicious or suspicious or like anomalous activity that's been missed by existing security controls and detection. So when we kind of think about this, it's weird. A lot of people don't have the feeling that like, oh, if I put threat intelligence into a platform, you know, that's not threat hunting. That's just looking for an IP. That's kind of crap. Because a lot of those people only believe in, you know, the hypothesis-driven process where it's give me a hypothesis, collect data, validate behavior, iterate and improve on that, and then you document that. Well, one of the biggest things that I've seen, and it helps a ton with the customers within their environment too, is just driving passion for the junior folks. So if we talk about, you know, a junior SOC analyst with little to no experience in threat hunting, but they've got passion. So say like, you know, they read Twitter and they come across the news of the SolarWinds breach. They immediately get excited and they want to check their environment to see if they've been affected. But how can a junior SOC analyst begin to threat hunt with little experience in this area? The easiest way is to pull the indicators and utilize the CSE threat intelligence feature, which we're looking at now. So I know that this isn't traditional threat hunting and this is just searching for an IP, but this really does build passion with like the junior folks and gives them a sense of purpose and really helps elevate them. So there's multiple ways that we can do this. The CSV one, like I said, is my favorite. The key with this though is when you import a CSV within here, you've got to have these values at the top. So you have to have value, source, confidence, tags, and then your TTL. So this is just a couple of the SolarWinds IOCs that we've seen. So we've got the IPs, domain names, some hashes, etc. And then, you know, the source is FireEye, and then our confidence in some of these. And then we kind of have tags for malware, dark halo, sunburst, etc. And then the TTL. So the key here is time to live. We don't want these indicators to persist forever. Like threat intel, like once it's been observed and publicly acknowledged, the value drops rather quickly as everything's been burned. So for me, generally, I'll use like 30 days is a good place. For hashes, you know, definitely longer on there. But there's exceptions to that. So, you know, once we've uploaded the IOCs, it's important to note that correlation of these IOCs will only occur going forward. So to check if we've been compromised, we'll need to perform a retro hunt with these IOCs. So this can easily be achieved by pivoting to our cloud intelligence platform and running a custom scan. So first what we'll do is we'll just say create. You can give this kind of like any name we want. And just do like test IOCs, description, sunburst. Custom source, where is it? Test IOCs. All right, so this is where we'll import the indicator. So what we did there was we actually created the threat intel list, and we can just do import, and then this is where we would drag our CSV file into, and then you can give it an expiration date if you want. And then we'll import this. Okay. And then you can see here at the bottom, we've updated and it imported 54. It takes like a minute. Like if we refresh, should come back up. Yep. There's our indicators that are within there. Okay. So now that we have these and we know that, going forward, we'll get notifications for these, we want to pivot to SIP, and this is where we're going to do our retro hunt. So we'll go to SIP, and I'll sign in real quick. Stop the share. Okay. So we're logged in. Not the prettiest query, but it gets the job done. So essentially we just took the SIEM source that we're looking for is record, and then all of the indicators that we had, and I just did, just 7 days back. You can do, 60, 100, whatever you've got data retention for is what you can query across. And we can see that we've got nothing in here. So, all right, our junior analyst now has performed, the retro hunt and verifies that there's nothing there. So this might seem sort of like a logical stopping point, but there's still more to be gleaned from this. So we'll pivot back to here, and then we'll go to rules. So luckily, the analyst, while reading more about the details of the attack, came across more tactics, techniques, and procedures that they currently don't have any alerting capabilities on. Thankfully, they've recently decided to enable advanced audit policy, and specifically Event ID 4688 process creation, and they enabled command line process auditing. They also had the foresight to ensure that PowerShell auditing was enabled, specifically Event ID 4104 script block logging and Event ID 4698 scheduled task creation, meaning they now have the ability to audit command lines, PowerShell, and scheduled task creation. Our analyst decides that it would be a good idea to set up a rule that looks specifically at scheduled task creation via PowerShell. So scheduled tasks are often overlooked in environments, and an excellent way to establish persistence or execution or privilege escalation. So if you're not familiar with this, glance at MITRE ATT&CK, look at scheduled tasks, and you'll see it's heavily utilized. So the analyst decides also that their understanding with the organization is that, no one that they're aware of is creating scheduled tasks via PowerShell. So this might be a really good opportunity to create a rule within CSE and alert on that type of activity. So if we wanted to do that, we would go to content rules, that's where we're at now, and we can hit create. So we have multiple types of rules that you can do. So you could do a match, a threshold, a chain, or you can do aggregation. These all have value, and they all have their time and place when they should be utilized. So we'll look at a match today and do this. So for this one, what we're going to want to do is going to edit this. And there we go. Okay, so these are all SQL based. When we're utilizing our rules or when we create these are simple SQL expressions. So what we're looking for here is base image is PowerShell or PowerShell ISE or PWSH. And then we're looking for ways that scheduled tasks can be created. What we want here on the entity is device, host name. So there's a lot of options that you can select here. You can do by IP, et cetera. It just depends if the log source has that. And then this is where you would give your rule a name. So we'll say like test PowerShell sketch task. Description, PowerShell created a scheduled task, and then stage. So these are MITRE ATT&CK pretty much. So for this one, we'll just say persistence. Okay. And then severity. So this is where you give it that score. So as we had mentioned before, like, your insight threshold is set to 13. If you create this as like a 10 this and like one other signal is probably going to fire an insight, but we're not sure how we feel about this yet. So maybe we just do like a 4. Okay. And then we can submit this. We can name it up here too. So this would be test PowerShell. Scheduled task. Okay, so that rule is in. You can see who created it, etc. And then, all right, so now that we have it configured, it's important to note that this is also much like threat intelligence. Like this is only going to correlate going forward. So if the analyst wanted to perform a retro hunt around the scheduled task creation, they would again have to pivot to SIP and run a query much like we did with the threat intelligence earlier. So let's do that and see. So this is one I ran before. Obviously, I fed this data in so that we could get results from this. So this is a sysmon log that picked this up, and we can see parent command lines in here, the base image, and then the actual command line that was run is right here. So we're looking for any scheduled task that's being created by PowerShell. So we can see that over 7 days, we've gotten 2 hits from our search. So this could be a good sign, but unfortunately we know from our research that Dark Halo utilizes this technique for lateral movement. So what do we do next? There's a lot of options here. Obviously we know that our rule works and it has produced results. We want to ensure though that going forward, if this type of activity were to occur again, we'd have an insight fire so that we would immediately be able to see that. But before we create custom insight for this, this is where we want to ask ourselves, do we have any opportunity to tune this rule that we created even further so that if an insight does fire, we can ensure it is of higher fidelity? So by looking at this event, do we see anything that leads us to believe that this may be a false positive? Like, does this machine belong to Bob in security who perhaps was creating test content? Or, what about a crazy new vulnerability scanner that happens to create scheduled tasks via PowerShell? Or maybe this is expected behavior from a new administrator you've hired. So it's important to vet this data, because if the case is true that this is a false positive, this is where we can utilize those match lists that we had talked about earlier. By adding like the IP to the appropriate match list and updating our rule to reflect that match list, we can drastically reduce the amount of false positives that we see. So this is perhaps one of the biggest wins in reducing alert fatigue. It's extremely important when you generate content like this that you follow some sort of data validation practice. So we want to make sure that this is in fact legitimate. So if we go back here and we go to signals, and let's look for so we're looking at scheduled tasks created via PowerShell. Oops. There we go. So this is the same record that we saw in SIP. This is where we kind of want to see, what's occurring with this. And this is where we would start to do our actual data validation. So we can see, we've got Win10 here. That's the host name. We've got the command line, so we can actually see. So obviously this host name is pivoting to Win10. So if we click here, or, like hypothetically, like maybe we know that this device is an admin's box, or this is a security testing system, like that could be where the false positive is. We could whitelist this out, but maybe we don't know. So if we wanted to dig into this, you can click and there's a ton of actions you can do. So if this was like an IP address, et cetera, like, we could go to like virus total. If it was a hash, there's a bunch of different ways that we could look at this. So for this one, what we could do is we can look at this entity. So we know that this user, SpecOps, is the user that was logged in when the scheduled task was created. So we can also see by pivoting to that user, we've got signals, insights, and history. And we can see there's a ton of signals for this user over a couple month period here. So we've got deleting the backup catalog, PowerShell process discovery, IP config command, domain trust discovery of system time, the scheduled task created. So like obviously this doesn't look good. So this is sort of where we would say like, okay, our data is validated. And then what we would want to do so that the signal doesn't get buried, with the ton that are in here, is this is when we're going to want to create a custom insight. So if we go to here, this is custom insights. So these are some of the ones that we currently have. You just hit create, and then you can add pretty much any rule that you want. And there'll be a whole bunch within here. You give it a description after you've selected the rule that you're interested in. So we can say we want that. And then you give it the insight name that you want. So it could be like PowerShell, schedule task creation. Oops. And then give it a description and then give it a severity. So what this does is it skips the summary that an insight needs, like that, the score of 13. So the signals must sum to 13 for an insight to fire. Instead, what we're saying is we have such high confidence in this signal that we created that we want an insight to fire every single time one of these signals is seen. So that's a good way to bubble up stuff that might be lost normally, or for your stuff that's extremely high fidelity. So that's generally sort of what we like to do. All right, so it's custom insights. So we go back to the HUD. Okay, so we've gone from pretty much at this point reading about the SolarWinds breach, talking publicly about like the threat intel to enrich our log ingestion, and to furthering our knowledge by focusing on specific techniques used by the Dark Halo actor that we now know is heavily utilized techniques for persistence thanks to MITRE ATT&CK. So thanks to ensuring that we're logging the correct sources, we were able to create a signal and use some data validation to ensure that it is working properly. So knowing that our scheduled task created with PowerShell signal is valid, we took it one step further and created an insight so that we'll be alerted immediately upon our logic firing. The goal here was to demonstrate that even a junior analyst can begin to get involved in the hunting process and slowly build upon the foundational knowledge to eventually get to the point where they're able to perform more robust data analysis and in a more kind of traditional threat hunting way. The key was that we wanted to demonstrate the ease with which CSE product can be utilized. So a lot of the threat hunting that we, the SpecOps group, perform is not necessarily able to be wrapped into a nice bundled rule like we just demonstrated. Even with the robust matchless functionality, sometimes the data is too far overwhelming to use a matchless. There's just too much out there. So when this is the case, this is when we turn to the investigation tab and to utilize the Zeppelin notebooks that we have within there. So we've formulated probably a couple hundred queries that we schedule with cron jobs to kind of sift through the data and allow us to take action upon the results. So let's just take kind of a quick look at some of those. So we'll look at intelligence. So this is your standard Zeppelin notebook. We're utilizing JSQL in here as our language of choice. You can see we kind of have a couple of paragraphs with some of the information, some of the techniques that we're looking at and the tactics. And you can see we're looking at, threat intel. So we want to know flow data by destination IP, DNS data by domain, DNS data by top level domain. Threat intel, this is file data by hash. And then we have sort of some of our own threat intel that we utilize. So this would be some of the suspicious AS watch list flow data. There's a bunch within here. And then, this one is just specifically centered around threat intelligence. We've got ones for Windows-based desktops, Linux-based desktops, DNS, DHCP, AWS, et cetera. Like if there's a product out there and we can get data for it, that's what we're going to do. And just to take like a quick look, like, so this is just suspicious sinkhole IP watch list flow data. So, you know, it's just a SQL query. That's all we're putting within here, and it's just filtering through the data. And as results pop up, that's when we begin our investigations and dig a little bit deeper within them. So that's kind of the workflow that we utilize. There's a lot of functionality within this product. So I just kind of wanted to conclude with, you know, I know that was a lot to digest, and I want to thank you guys very much for taking the time to listen to me ramble. I hope the overview of CSE was useful, and that you come out of this demo with some ideas and perhaps some new ways to approach threat hunting. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, well, with that, we are out of time. I have let people know that I'll be sure to send any questions that were asked to the Sumo Logic team to respond directly. So thank you so much, Jake, James, and Brian, for your great presentation, and to Sumo Logic for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.